How Theosophy Came to Me by Charles Webster Leadbeater. Chapter 1. In Ancient Greece. My initial contact with anything that could unequivocally be designated as Theosophy occurred in the year 504 BC, when I was accorded the profound honor and gratification of visiting the illustrious philosopher Pythagoras. I had taken birth within a family of the Athenian Eupatridae, a lineage in comfortable circumstances, which afforded highly propitious opportunities for advancement. This visit constituted the most momentous event of my youth, transpiring in the following manner. A kinsman of mine proposed to convey me, along with a brother some 2 years my junior, upon a voyage aboard a vessel of which he was a part owner. It was a commercial enterprise among the Grecian islands and across to the Asiatic littoral. Given the unhurried maritime practices of that epoch, the voyage occupied nearly a 12-month, during which we visited numerous localities and beheld not only magnificent natural landscapes but also diverse wondrous temples adorned with the most exquisite sculpture. Among other islands, we made port at Samos, wherein we encountered the venerable Pythagoras, who was then of advanced years and drawing nigh unto his demise. Certain historians have conjectured that this sage perished when his school at Crotona was destroyed by popular animosity. Others, cognizant that he survived that catastrophe, believe that his death occurred much later at Metapontum. Neither of these hypotheses appears to be correct. In his extreme old age, he departed from his institutions in Magna Graecia and returned to his ancestral estate in Samos, intending to conclude his earthly days where they had commenced. Thus it was that we were blessed with the singular privilege of meeting him during the course of our voyage. His preeminent disciple at that juncture was Cleinias. He treated us with exceeding benevolence, patiently addressing our eager inquiries and elucidating the tenets of the Pythagorean philosophy. We were instantly and powerfully drawn to the doctrines expounded to us, and conceived an ardent desire to enter his school. Cleinias informed us that a branch of the academy would shortly be established in Athens. In the interim, he imparted to us profound instruction in ethics, the doctrine of metempsychosis, and the mystery of numbers. All too swiftly, our vessel was prepared for departure, and we were compelled, with profound regret, to bid farewell to Pythagoras and Cleinias. To our immense and reverent delight, when we attended upon him to take our leave, the aged philosopher bestowed his blessing upon us, pronouncing with marked emphasis, "We shall meet again." Within a year or two, tidings of his passing reached us, and we frequently pondered the precise meaning he intended by those words. Yet, when in my present incarnation I was first accorded the privilege of meeting the Master Cthulhu, he recalled that distant scene to my memory and inquired, "Did I not tell you that we should meet again?" Shortly after the demise of Pythagoras, Cleinias fulfilled his promise to journey to Athens and establish a school of philosophy there, and naturally, my brother and I were among his earliest disciples. A great multitude was attracted by his teachings, and the philosophy assumed a preeminent position in the intellectual discourse of the age. Excepting those duties strictly requisite for the administration of the family estate, I dedicated virtually my entire time to the study and dissemination of this philosophy, eventually succeeding to the office of Cleinias upon his decease. My early attitude. It may have been by virtue of this exclusive devotion to such elevated thought that I enjoyed an exceptionally protracted sojourn in the heavenly world, spanning slightly more than 2,300 years. To what extent this circumstance has influenced my present existence I am unable to determine. Nevertheless, I entered this incarnation devoid of any conscious recollection of all that I had acquired at the cost of so much time and diligence. In my early years, I possessed no knowledge whatsoever of these matters. Yet, in retrospect, I perceive that I found myself endowed with a set of convictions which I had evidently carried over from that prior existence. The mid-19th century was an epoch of pervasive materialism, characterized by skepticism or at least profound uncertainty regarding spiritual matters, and a disdainful rejection of the possibility of any non-physical manifestations. Even in my childhood, I was cognizant of the vehement debates concerning the existence of the deity and the potential survival of human consciousness beyond bodily death. Yet, upon overhearing such disputations, I wondered in silence how men could be so foolish, for I myself possessed an unshakable inner certainty regarding these truths, though I was unable to defend my convictions through formal argument or to adduce any rational proof in their support. Nonetheless, I knew that God existed, that He was benevolent, and that physical death did not mark the cessation of life. Even at that tender age, I was capable of deducing from these certainties that all must ultimately be well, notwithstanding that circumstances so frequently appeared adverse. I recall vividly my horror when a youthful playfellow introduced me to the concept of eternal damnation. I promptly refuted his assertion, yet he insisted upon its veracity because his father had declared it to be so. I returned home in great indignation to consult my own father regarding this incredible abomination. He, however, merely smiled with tolerant indulgence and remarked, "Well, my boy, I do not for a moment credit it myself, yet many people hold that view, and it is futile to attempt to disabuse them of it. You must simply endure their opinion." Thus, by degrees, I learned that one's personal, internal conviction, however profound, was of little avail as an argument against orthodox dogma. I appear to have retained one other curious fragment of partial recollection from that Grecian incarnation. As a child, I frequently dreamed of a particular dwelling, entirely dissimilar to any with which I was then acquainted on the physical plane, for it was constructed around a central courtyard into which all the chambers opened. I would dream of this residence perhaps thrice weekly. I was familiar with every room and all its inhabitants, and I would constantly describe it to my mother and draft ground plans of its layout. We came to refer to it as my dream house. As I matured, these dreams recurred with diminishing frequency, until at last the image faded entirely from my memory. Yet, one day, much later in life, in order to illustrate a certain point, my master deigned to show me a representation of the dwelling I had occupied in my previous incarnation, and I recognized it instantaneously. Although, as previously stated, I possessed the most absolute internal conviction regarding existence after death, I soon recognized that, in discussing the subject with others, it would be of immense advantage to possess evidence of a physical nature. It occurred to me that such proof should be discoverable, provided one were willing to devote a certain measure of time and effort to its pursuit. I recalled that, as a youth, I encountered a copy of Mrs. Crow's Night Side of Nature, which I perused with the utmost interest. It seemed to me that, were I afforded the opportunity to investigate at first-hand occurrences similar to those she described, I should in due course arrive at some definite evidence which I might cite in response to inquiries. Personal investigations. Occasionally, there would appear in some journal an account of a spectral apparition or of bizarre occurrences within a haunted house. Whenever such a report came to my attention, I immediately journeyed to the scene of the alleged phenomenon, interrogated such witnesses as I could locate, and expended considerable time and effort in attempting to encounter the phantom myself. Naturally, in a great number of instances, my efforts yielded no result. Either there was no evidence worthy of consideration, or the apparition declined to manifest when desired. Even when a witness was found who could relate a reasonably credible narrative, it appeared that the specter did not linger long enough to say or do anything of notable interest, or perhaps it was the witness who had failed to remain. Nonetheless, amid the wearisome monotony of numerous failures, there would occasionally emerge a welcome oasis of definite success, and I gradually amassed a body of direct evidence which would have rendered my conviction absolute, had any such reassurance been necessary. Concurrently, I also investigated numerous instances of the phenomenon known as second sight, predominantly in the Highlands. Therein, I once more discovered that any impartial observer disposed to exert a modest degree of effort could readily satisfy himself as to the genuineness of these occurrences. Spiritualism. Regrettably, I was at that juncture entirely unaware of another potential avenue of inquiry, namely that of spiritualism. The earliest occasion upon which, to the best of my recollection, I ever heard of such matters was in connection with the séances conducted by Mr. D. Home for the Emperor Napoleon III. A series of articles delineating these events was penned by the Reverend Maurice Davies for the Daily Telegraph. However, his assertions appeared utterly incredible to me at the time, and whilst reading one of these accounts aloud to my mother one evening, I expressed grave doubts regarding the possibility of its accuracy. The article concluded, nevertheless, with the observation that anyone disinclined to credit the narrative might easily convince himself of its possibility by assembling a few companions and inducing them to sit quietly about a small table, either in darkness or in subdued light, with the palms of their hands resting lightly upon its surface. It was suggested that an even simpler method entailed placing an ordinary silk hat upon the table, brim uppermost, and permitting 2 or 3 individuals to rest their hands lightly upon the brim. The author asserted that the hat or table would shortly commence to rotate, thereby demonstrating the existence of a force independent of the volition of any participant. This procedure appeared remarkably uncomplicated, and my mother suggested that, as dusk was just falling and the hour seemed propitious, we should conduct the experiment forthwith. Accordingly, I procured a small, round, pedestal table, the customary function of which was to support a flower pot containing a magnificent arum lily. I fetched my own silk hat from the stand in the hall, positioned it upon the table, and we placed our hands upon its brim in the prescribed manner. The sole individual present besides my mother and myself was a young lad of 12 years who, as we subsequently discovered, was a powerful physical medium. At that time, however, I possessed no knowledge of such matters. I do not believe that any of us anticipated any result whatsoever, and I was profoundly astonished when the hat executed a gentle yet decisive half-turn upon the polished surface of the table. Each of us suspected that another had moved it unconsciously, but the object soon resolved that question, for it twirled and gyrated with such vigor that we found it difficult to maintain our touch upon it. At my suggestion, we elevated our hands. The hat rose beneath them, as if adhered to them, and remained suspended a few inches above the table for several moments before descending once more. This further development astonished me even more, and I endeavored to replicate the phenomenon. For several minutes the hat declined to respond, yet when at last it did ascend as before, it lifted the table along with it. Here was my own familiar silk hat, which I had never hitherto suspected of possessing any occult properties, suspending itself mysteriously in the air beneath our fingertips, and, not content with defying the laws of gravity on its own account, adhering to the table by its crown and elevating that object as well. I cast my gaze downward to the feet of the table. They were approximately 6 inches above the carpet, and no human foot was touching them or even in their vicinity. I swept my own foot beneath the table, but there was assuredly nothing there, nothing physically perceptible, at least. Naturally, upon the initial movement of the hat, the suspicion had crossed my mind that the young boy might be practicing some deception. However, not only was he patently innocent of this, but it would have been physically impossible for him to produce such an effect unobserved. After approximately 2 minutes, the table disengaged from the hat and fell, and almost immediately the hat descended to join its companion. Nevertheless, the experiment was repeated several times at intervals of a few minutes. Subsequently, the table began to rock violently and cast the hat aside. A clear intimation to us, had any of our number possessed the knowledge to interpret it. Yet, none of us had any conception of how to proceed, although we remained keenly interested in these extraordinary movements. I did not myself regard the phenomenon in the least as a manifestation from the deceased, but rather as the discovery of some extraordinary and novel physical force. This somewhat frivolous initiation prompted me to undertake further inquiries, and I soon discovered that a considerable body of literature was devoted to the subject, and that I might extend my investigations significantly through seances with established mediums. Naturally, I encountered a degree of charlatanism, and still more ineptitude, yet I was presently able to satisfy myself beyond all doubt that at least some of these manifestations were attributable to the agency of those whom we designate as the dead. There is scarcely any phenomenon of which I have read in spiritualistic literature, or heard recounted in spiritualistic circles, that I have not myself witnessed under rigorous test conditions. Any reader desiring a more comprehensive account of my investigations and their results will find it in my volume, The Other Side of Death, or in that brief portion of the same work which is published independently under the title Spiritualism and Theosophy. I have recounted certain events of my early life in considerable detail in order to elucidate for my readers the state of mind in which I found myself when Theosophy was eventually presented to me, a state which, I believe, explains the immediacy of my response to it. Perhaps I ought also to mention one further incident from my pre-theosophical life which, however insignificant in itself, predisposed me to accept much that I might otherwise have regarded with skepticism. A story of Madame Blavatsky. The very first report I received concerning our esteemed founder, Madame Blavatsky, was both curious and characteristic, and the receipt of it constituted a most significant epoch in my life, though I was entirely unaware of its import at the time. A loyal companion of my school days had embraced a seafaring career, and about the year 1879, he was serving as second officer aboard one of the coastal vessels of the British India Steam Navigation Company. During a voyage from Bombay to Colombo, Madame Blavatsky chanced to travel upon that very steamer, and my friend was thus brought into direct contact with that extraordinary personality. He subsequently related to me 2 highly singular anecdotes concerning her. It appeared that one evening, whilst on the bridge, he was attempting in vain to light his pipe in a gale. Being on duty, he was unable to leave his post. Consequently, he struck match after match, only to witness each flame instantly extinguished by the wind. At length, with a gesture of impatience, he abandoned the endeavor. As he drew himself up, he observed just beneath him a dark figure closely enveloped in a cloak, and the clear voice of Madame Blavatsky hailed him. "Are you unable to light it, then?" "No," he replied. "I do not believe that anyone could maintain a flame in such a wind as this." "Try once more," said Madame Blavatsky. He laughed. Yet he struck another match, and he assured me that, in the very teeth of the gale and entirely unsheltered, The match burned with a steady flame down to the fingers that held it. He was so utterly astounded that he quite forgot to light his pipe, whilst Helena Blavatsky merely laughed and turned away. Upon another occasion during the voyage, the chief officer made, in Madame Blavatsky's presence, some casual allusion to his intentions regarding the return voyage from Calcutta. She interrupted him, saying, "No, you will not do so, for you shall not make the return voyage at all. Upon your arrival in Calcutta, you will be appointed captain of another vessel, and your course will lie in an entirely different direction." "Madam," said the chief officer, "I wish with all my heart that you might be correct, but it is an impossibility. It is true that I possess a master's certificate, yet there are many ahead of me upon the promotional list. Furthermore, I have entered into an agreement to serve upon the coasting route for a term of 5 years. "All that is of no consequence," replied Madame Blavatsky. "You shall find that events will transpire precisely as I have foretold." And so it transpired, for upon the vessel's arrival in Calcutta, it was discovered that an unanticipated vacancy had arisen, and there was no other individual available to occupy the position save for that very first officer. Thus, the prophecy, which had hitherto appeared entirely implausible, was realized to the letter. Many years thereafter, whilst journeying from Java to India in the company of Mr. Van Manen, I took passage upon a steamer commanded by the selfsame gentleman who had been the first officer of my friend's narrative. He related the occurrence from his own perspective, thereby precisely corroborating the original account. These details were, in themselves, of no great moment, yet they carried profound implications, and their indirect influence upon me was considerable. Indeed, within a year of that conversation, Mr. A. P. Sinnett's volume, The Occult World, came into my possession, and upon observing Madame Blavatsky's name therein, I immediately recalled the anecdotes recounted by my friend. Naturally, the compelling first-hand evidence I had already received regarding her extraordinary faculties predisposed me to concede the plausibility of those other unfamiliar and wondrous matters of which Mr. Sinnett wrote. Consequently, those 2 brief narratives played a significant role in my life, preparing me as they did for the immediate and ardent acceptance of theosophical truths. Chapter 2. The Occult World. I have previously remarked that the initial theosophical work to come into my possession was Mr. A. P. Sinnett's The Occult World. Having observed it advertised within a catalogue of antiquarian volumes, I was greatly attracted by the title. I therefore dispatched an order for it forthwith and was fortunate enough to secure a copy. Naturally, the accounts contained therein interested me profoundly, yet its true allure resided in the glimpses it afforded of a magnificent philosophical system and of a species of esoteric science which appeared to offer a rational explanation of existence and to account for numerous phenomena I had myself observed. I was, understandably, eager to acquire far greater knowledge of these matters. Yet I was so entirely unacquainted with the customs of the literary sphere that I was quite at a loss as to how to initiate further inquiries. Guided by subsequent experience, I now perceive that it would have been a simple matter to address a communication to the author in care of his publishers. However, such a solution to the difficulty failed to present itself to my mind. At the conclusion of his volume, Mr. Sinnett observes, "Certain readers who find themselves interested, yet are slow to discern what practical course they might pursue, may inquire how they may demonstrate their appreciation of this opportunity. My response shall be fashioned after the celebrated injunction of Sir Robert Peel. Register, register, register. Take the initial step toward responding to the overture emanating from the occult world. Register, register, register. That is to say, affiliate with the Theosophical Society, the sole association which is currently connected by any recognized bond of union to the Brotherhood of Adepts in Thibet. I was exceedingly desirous of acting upon this counsel, yet I found the endeavor by no means easy to accomplish. The author recorded the existence of a Theosophical Society in London, but omitted to provide its address, and my search for it within the post office directory proved entirely fruitless. I initiated numerous inquiries among my acquaintances, yet it did not happen that I encountered anyone capable of assisting me in my quest. Shortly thereafter, however, whilst I was in Scotland investigating the evidence for second sight in the Highlands, I discovered, seemingly by the sheerest coincidence, upon a table in a hotel reading room a copy of a diminutive spiritualistic periodical, scarcely larger than a leaflet. If memory serves, it was entitled Rays of Light or some similar appellation. Within its pages was a notice concerning Dr. Anna Kingsford, President of the London Lodge of the Theosophical Society, which remarked that she was the wife of the incumbent of some West Country parish. I believe the locality was named Atcham. Naturally, I seized upon this clue and immediately addressed a letter to her at that vicarage, requesting further particulars. A considerable interval elapsed before I received a response, for, as subsequently transpired, Dr. Kingsford was then traveling on the continent, and when the reply did arrive, it proved to be merely a printed circular, exquisitely produced, however, with a surfeit of silver ornamentation. Nevertheless, it supplied the very intelligence I required, the address of the London secretary, and it further apprised me that, to gain admission to the society, I must be proposed and seconded by 2 existing members. How I joined. The secretary of the society was Mr. Kirby. I dispatched a communication to him without delay, explaining my desire to affiliate, but noting that I did not enjoy the acquaintance of any current members, and inquiring as to my proper course of action. Once more, I was obliged to wait a considerable duration for a reply, as Mr. Kirby was likewise abroad, engaged, I believe, in mountaineering in Switzerland. Eventually, however, he responded in austere terms, stating that the regulations were inviolable and that no exceptions could be permitted, though he suggested, as an afterthought, that I might wait upon either Mr. A. P. Sinnott or Mr. G. B. Finch. Acting upon this advice, I addressed a note to Mr. Sinnott, scarcely daring to hope that he was indeed the author of the volume that had so profoundly impressed me. His response speedily resolved my doubts and contained an invitation to visit him in London. Having but recently returned from India, he was then residing temporarily at the home of his mother-in-law, Mrs. Edenser, in Royal Crescent, Notting Hill. He received me with the utmost benevolence and warmth, and we naturally conversed at length upon his writings and the extraordinary revelations they contained. The more I was apprised of Theosophy, the more eager I became to acquire whatever knowledge could be imparted to me. Yet when I broached the subject of entering the Theosophical Society, Mr. Sinnott assumed a highly grave demeanor and expressed the opinion that such a step would scarcely be advisable, in view of my office as a clergyman. I marveled somewhat that the society should exercise such discrimination against members of the clergy, and at length I ventured, not without diffidence, to pose the question. Mr. Sinnott replied, "You must understand," he observed, "that we are accustomed to debating every subject and every doctrine from first principles, entirely free from any preconceived notions. Consequently, I fear that at our gatherings you would be liable to hear much that would shock you profoundly." I had, several years prior to this, attended some of Mrs. Besant's lectures at the Hall of Science in Old Street, near the City Road, and I reasoned that, having survived those discourses, nothing the members of the Theosophical Society might utter would be likely to cause me serious offense. I therefore assured Mr. Sinnett with a smile that I trusted I was not a clergyman of so sensitive a disposition, and that I stood prepared to participate in any discussion that might arise, regardless of the personal convictions of the participants. Upon hearing this, Mr. Sinnett's manner partially softened, and he went so far as to remark that, if such were indeed the case, he should take particular pleasure in admitting a member of the clergy. He added, however, that before taking so decisive a step, he must consult his counsel. We were thus obliged to leave the matter unresolved, and I returned to my rural curacy 50 miles distant in Hampshire. Mr. A. P. Sinnett. Within a week, however, I received a communication from Mr. Sinnett informing me that a majority of the council had consented to my admission, and stating that, should I complete the requisite forms, he would be pleased to propose me himself. He further recommended that I wait upon Mr. G. B. Finch, who would in all likelihood second my application provided I made a favorable impression upon him. Mr. Finch proved to be quite as gracious as Mr. Sinnett, and I was subsequently notified of my formal acceptance into the society, with the instruction that I might be initiated should I call at his residence on a designated evening. By that period, Mr. Sinnett had relocated to his own residence in Ladbroke Gardens, and it was to that address that I duly repaired at the appointed hour. Upon my arrival, I discovered that I was to be initiated into the mysteries of the society in the company of 2 other candidates, namely Professor and Mrs. Crooks. Even at that juncture, I was fully sensible of the honor of being admitted in the company of so eminent a scientist, for although Professor Crooks had not yet received his knighthood as Sir William, I was well aware of his renown as the discoverer of thallium, the inventor of the radiometer, and the proponent of radiant matter. In those days, admission into the Theosophical Society constituted a somewhat formidable undertaking. Upon our arrival, we found Mrs. Sinnett's spacious drawing-room crowded to excess, the assemblage indeed overflowing onto the landing and extending some distance up the staircase. I estimate that approximately 200 individuals were present, among whom were several bearing highly distinguished names, such as Professor Myers, C.C., Massey, and Stainton Moses, among others. The 3 of us were seated together upon a sofa in the center of the throng, whereupon Mr. Sinnett, having delivered an address on the aims and endeavors of the society, duly imparted to us a series of signs and passwords by which we might recognize our fellow members in any quarter of the globe. These signs and words have since fallen into disuse in most countries, though I believe our President still imparts them to such candidates as she receives in India. Following this event, I rarely absented myself from the lodge meetings, journeying to London almost weekly. Indeed, Mr. Sinnett was hospitable enough to extend a standing invitation for me to dine and pass the night at his residence on these occasions, as my own home lay some 50 miles distant. At these dinners and the subsequent gatherings, I encountered numerous prominent figures and was privy to many highly engaging and instructive conversations. It must be recalled that the entire body of teaching was at that time altogether novel to us, that our understanding of many points remained highly imperfect, and that consequently there existed ample scope for discussion. The planetary chains, the various planes of nature, and the states of consciousness associated with each, all these concepts arrived as a novel revelation, and we experienced considerable difficulty in reconciling the disparate assertions contained in the replies to Mr. Sinnett's manifold inquiries. The sun of our current president had not yet risen above the theosophical horizon, so we had no one to unravel the tangled skeins or to bring the seemingly conflicting statements into harmony. I recall causing a minor stir at the dinner table by declaring that the most apparent course of action would be for each of us to resolve firmly to become a pupil of one of the great adept masters. This suggestion apparently startled those present, for it was received in absolute silence. Only after a perceptible pause did Mr. Sinnett remark that he supposed Europeans could scarcely hope for such an attainment at our current stage of knowledge. A statement true enough, yet I maintained that we might at least direct our endeavors resolutely toward that end. In those days, these meetings of the London Lodge constituted virtually our sole source of theosophical information. I believe we were an exceptionally earnest group of students, yet there was in truth very little material available for our study. Aside from Mr. Sinnett's 2 volumes, we possessed Madame Blavatsky's monumental work Isis Unveiled, as well as an excellent treatise by Dr. Anna Kingsford entitled The Perfect Way, or The Finding of Christ. This latter volume contained a wealth of information, yet it was presented from a perspective entirely different from that of Mr. Sinnett's works, and was, for most of us, far more difficult to comprehend. Isis Unveiled presents a vast, chaotic repository of highly intriguing material, yet we found it exceedingly difficult to derive from it anything resembling a coherent or systematic doctrine. Nevertheless, we persevered as best we could, and shortly thereafter we received the profound encouragement of learning that the Master Kuthumi was pleased with our endeavors, and would dispatch one of his own disciples from India to assist us in our labors, Mr. M. Chatterjee. This disciple was Mr. Mohini Mohan Chatterjee, a young advocate from Calcutta, who arrived in London in the company of Colonel Olcott early in the year 1884. He proved, I must acknowledge, immensely helpful to us, and it was through his discourses that we first acquired a lucid conception of the path of initiation and its prerequisites. An exposition of these requirements, formulated in his own words, appears in the initial volume of the celebrated Transactions of the London Lodge. I distinctly recall the occasion of his inaugural appearance at one of Mr. Sinnett's evening receptions. Colonel Olcott and Mohini stood upon the hearthrug before the fireplace, where approximately 200 guests were presented to them individually. Among their number was the notorious Mr. Oscar Wilde, who invariably conveyed the impression of desiring to distinguish himself in both deportment and attire. On that evening, I recall, he was attired in black velvet, with knee breeches and white stockings. He approached Mohini, was duly introduced, bowed with elegance, and upon withdrawing, remarked to Mrs. Sinnett in a highly audible stage whisper, I never realized before what a mistake we make in being white. Mohini, being a Brahmin, was entirely unaccustomed to Western conventions, and I believe it caused him acute distress to permit that assemblage of wine-drinking outcasts to grasp his hand. He appeared exceedingly ill at ease, yet he endured the ordeal with fortitude, and naturally, none of us possessed the slightest inkling of his distress. He patiently answered a vast array of what must have appeared to him highly foolish and incredibly ignorant inquiries, and acquitted himself admirably as the lion of the evening, viewed with reverent awe by most of the elderly ladies present. Mr. Eglinton. In the course of my investigations into spiritualism, I had come into contact with most of the prominent mediums of the era, and had witnessed all the customary phenomena of which one reads in treatises on the subject. One medium with whom I was closely associated was Mr. Eglinton, and although I have heard derogatory reports concerning him, I must testify that in all my personal dealings with him, I found him to be exemplarily upright, reasonable, and courteous. He possessed various so-called controls, one being a Native American girl who called herself Daisy, and who chattered volubly on all occasions, whether appropriate or otherwise. Another was a tall Arab named Abdullah, standing well over 6 feet in height, who remained invariably silent, yet produced remarkable phenomena and frequently exhibited feats demonstrating immense physical strength. I have witnessed him lift 2 heavy men simultaneously, holding one in each hand. A third control who frequently appeared was named Ernest. He materialized relatively seldom, but often spoke in a direct voice and wrote in a distinctive, cultivated hand. One day, during a conversation with him, reference was made to the masters of the wisdom. Ernest spoke of them with the deepest reverence, asserting that he had on several occasions enjoyed the privilege of beholding them. I immediately inquired whether he would be willing to convey a message or letter to them, to which he replied that he would gladly do so, and would deliver it as opportunity permitted, though he could not specify precisely when that might occur. I may observe here that, in connection with this matter, I subsequently received a striking illustration of the unreliability of all such spiritual communications. Some considerable time thereafter, a certain spiritualist wrote to the journal Light, asserting that the masters could not possibly exist, because Ernest had positively assured him of their non-existence. I wrote to the same periodical to state that I possessed precisely the same unreliable authority for the assertion that the masters did exist, and that Ernest was well acquainted with them. In both instances, Ernest had evidently mirrored the thoughts of his interlocutor, as such entities are so frequently wont to do. To return to my narrative, I immediately accepted Ernest's offer provisionally. I stated that I would write a letter to one of these great masters and entrust it to his care, provided that my friend and preceptor, Mr. Sinnett, approved. Upon the mention of this name, the spirits exhibited considerable perturbation. Daisy, in particular, was highly incensed, declaring that she would have no dealings whatsoever with Mr. Sinnett under any circumstances. "Why, he calls us spooks," she exclaimed with great indignation. Nevertheless, I blandly persisted in my contention that my entire knowledge of Theosophy had been derived through Mr. Sinnett, and that I consequently did not feel justified in acting surreptitiously or seeking alternative channels of communication without first consulting him. Ultimately, albeit with exceedingly bad grace, the spirits consented to this arrangement, and the séance shortly thereafter reached its conclusion. Upon Mr. Eglinton's emergence from his trance, I inquired how I might transmit a letter to Ernest. He replied immediately that if I were to entrust the letter to him, he would place it in a specific box suspended upon the wall, from which Ernest would retrieve it at his convenience. I then hastened to Mr. Sinnett to solicit his counsel on the matter. He was instantly and eagerly interested, promptly advising me to accept the proposal and observe the outcome. A letter to the master. Thereupon, I returned home and composed 3 letters. The first was addressed to the Master Kuthumi, expressing to him, with the utmost reverence, that ever since I had first become acquainted with Theosophy, my sole desire had been to place myself under his guidance as a disciple. I apprised him of my current circumstances and inquired whether it was imperative that the 7 years of probation, of which I had heard, be spent in India. This missive I placed in a small envelope, which I secured diligently with my personal seal. I then enclosed it within a letter to Ernest, wherein I reminded him of his promise, requesting that he deliver the letter on my behalf and return with a reply, should one be granted. This second letter I sealed in the same manner as the first, subsequently enclosing it, alongside a brief note to Mr. Eglinton, requesting him to deposit it in his box and to inform me if any notice were taken of it. I had previously requested a friend residing with me to examine the seals of both letters under a microscope, so that, should they be returned to us, we might determine whether they had been compromised in any manner. By return post, I received a communication from Mr. Eglinton, informing me that he had duly placed the letter addressed to Ernest in his box, whence it had already vanished, and assuring me that he would immediately forward any reply that might be received. A few days thence, I received a letter addressed in an unfamiliar hand. Upon opening it, I discovered my own letter to Ernest, seemingly intact and unopened, though the name Ernest on the envelope had been struck through, with my own name inscribed beneath it in pencil. My friend and I once again subjected the seal to microscopic examination, failing to detect the slightest indication that the letter had been tampered with, and we both concurred that it was entirely impossible for it to have been opened. Nevertheless, upon slitting the envelope, I found that the letter I had addressed to the master had vanished. The sole content of the envelope was my own letter to Ernest, upon the blank page of which were written a few words in the latter's distinctive hand, stating that my missive had been duly delivered to the great master, and that should I in future be deemed worthy of a response, he would gladly convey it to me. Several months elapsed without a reply, and whenever I attended Mr. Eglinton's séances and chanced to encounter Ernest, I invariably inquired when I might anticipate a response. He consistently maintained that my letter had been duly delivered, but that nothing had yet been mentioned regarding a reply, and that it lay beyond his power to do more. 6 months later, however, a response did reach me, though not through the medium of Ernest. In this communication, the master stated that although he had not physically received the letter, he was, nevertheless, aware of what I had written, and he now proceeded to answer it. It will presently be necessary to elucidate the nature of his response and the subsequent measures I adopted. However, before this can be rendered fully intelligible, I must digress to recount certain other events that transpired during the interim, while I remained in hopeful expectation of that reply. Chapter 3. Practical Work. Naturally, once the fundamental tenets of Theosophy, as they were then understood, had become established in my mind, and I had firmly resolved to strive, however distant the ultimate realization might be, toward drawing nearer to the feet of the Master, I grew anxious to ascertain whether I might contribute in some manner to the practical endeavors of the Society. I posed this question to Mr. Sinnett, who, by way of reply, opened a commodious drawer entirely filled with correspondence, and remarked, "All of these are inquiries concerning Theosophy. They arrive daily in great numbers from every corner of the globe. I endeavor to address them in my own modest fashion, answering a few each day, yet I find myself utterly unable to cope with such an inundation. I am already in arrears to this considerable extent, and it is manifest that I shall never overtake the accumulation, for the backlog increases steadily with each passing day. Should you be willing to assume responsibility for this modest collection and respond to them to the best of your ability, you would indeed be rendering a significant service to a great many individuals." I, of course, demurred, objecting that my knowledge was as yet far too deficient to justify my assuming the role of an exponent of the doctrine. To this, however, he rejoined, "You have perused all the literature and attended almost all the meetings. I am persuaded that your understanding of the teachings is equal to my own. Furthermore, it is patently a matter of this or nothing. Given the administrative duties with which I am burdened, I shall never find the leisure to attend to them, whereas you, in the seclusion of your rural parish, may well succeed in addressing at least a portion of them. After all, we may always confer on any particularly intricate points that may arise. He was correct in his assertion that I had spared no effort to familiarize myself with this extraordinary new doctrine. I had read both of his volumes, not once but repeatedly, each reading, I believe, enhancing my appreciation of their value and enabling me to acquire a more secure grasp of the concepts expounded therein. Consequently, I filled a portmanteau with the correspondence and departed for Hampshire. I undertook the task with great enthusiasm, recalling that I permitted myself a mere 4 hours of sleep each night, and ultimately, I succeeded in working my way through the entire collection. It was an exceedingly arduous undertaking, for typewriters did not exist in those days, and every word of those many thousands had to be laboriously inscribed by hand. Certain of the inquiries were straightforward, while others proved highly complex. In numerous instances, extensive explanations were required, as the inquirer appeared to have misapprehended the teachings entirely. Nevertheless, I believe I acquitted myself to the best of my ability. Naturally, this elicited a multitude of replies, with the result that the contents of that drawer occupied the greater part of my leisure hours for several months. I may observe that a considerable number of new members joined the society as a consequence of this correspondence, and I likewise expanded both my circle of acquaintances and my own store of theosophical knowledge, for there exists no more efficacious method of mastering a subject thoroughly than attempting to instruct others in it. Dr. Kingsford, permit me to transition from these minor matters to an event of genuine import, my initial meeting with Madame Blavatsky. Yet, before I can properly recount that occasion, a few words of introductory explanation are required. Although Dr. Anna Kingsford held the office of President of the London Lodge, she was by no means in complete accord with the doctrines then being studied by its members. Mr. Sinnott's information was received in an Oriental guise from Eastern sages, in response to a succession of somewhat unsystematic inquiries which he had devised. Conversely, that which Dr. Kingsford imparted was derived from her own recollection of teachings acquired in a prior incarnation. Their agreement on essential principles was exceedingly remarkable, yet the framework in which the respective teachings were presented differed widely, each possessing its own distinct terminology, which was by no means invariably interchangeable. At our assemblies, it was customary for Mr. Sinnott to deliver an address or present a statement. Prior to any discussion or inquiry regarding points of doubt, however, Dr. Kingsford invariably insisted upon reformulating the entire thesis in her own terminology and from her personal perspective. To the vast majority of those present, the Oriental exposition was far more intelligible than the Hermetic. Consequently, to our eager minds, this superfluous complication seemed intolerable, and Dr. Kingsford's protracted disquisitions were received with a degree of impatience. Not content with merely presenting her own case, she occasionally verged perilously close to casting aspersions upon Mr. Sinnott's presentation, and indeed upon the masters from whom it emanated. It will be readily appreciated that such conduct tended to arouse considerable indignation among the members. On one occasion, the Lodge adopted a resolution expressing regret at the attitude displayed in a treatise she had authored, an incident that engendered a highly regrettable state of tension. We progressed so far as to publish pamphlets delineating the opposing arguments, a debate in which even Swami T. Subba Rao, residing in distant India, participated. These discordant conditions persisted when Colonel Olcott and Mr. Mohini Mohan Chatterjee arrived from India, whereupon the Lodge fractured into two highly unequal factions. Indeed, Dr. Kingsford's sole adherents were her uncle, Mr. Maitland, and a small circle of personal associates whom she had introduced upon her admission. Had Madame Blavatsky herself been present, she would likely have resolved the dispute summarily. However, though she had departed India in the company of Colonel Olcott, she had fallen gravely ill in Paris, and was indeed believed to be in imminent peril. In due course, the conclusion of our financial year arrived, bringing with it the necessity of electing a president for the succeeding 12 months. It was, I believe, the virtually unanimous desire of the lodge that Mr. Sinnett should assume the nominal as well as the actual leadership. He was, however, reluctant to accept the office, as he had expressed himself with some vehemence against Dr. Kingsford during the pamphlet dispute, and wished to avoid importing this nigh personal animosity into the governance of the lodge. Upon the evening of the election, Mr. Maitland proposed the reappointment of Dr. Kingsford, yet secured the support of merely 1 or 2 members, a rejection to which Dr. Kingsford reacted with highly undignified vexation. Mr. Sinnett thereupon rose to propose Mr. G. B. Finch, a barrister of Lincoln's in who had formerly distinguished himself as senior wrangler at Cambridge. Possessing both intellect and benevolence, he was highly esteemed by the membership. Indeed, that very meeting was convened in a spacious hall within his chambers at Lincoln's Inn. He was immediately elected by an overwhelming majority, after which we appointed Mr. Sinnett as secretary and proceeded with the business of the evening. Dr. Kingsford, however, was visibly displeased by the outcome of the election, and her incessant interruptions proved more exasperating than ever. The president founder himself presided over the assembly, yet he appeared uncertain as to how he might manage the lady, and the proceedings languished in a tedious and unproductive manner. The chamber, as previously noted, was elongated, with the entrance situated on one side, near the end furthest from the dais. The room was furnished with benches hired temporarily for the occasion. It so transpired that my friend Mr. Varley and I arrived several minutes late, entering the hall shortly after the proceedings had commenced. Consequently, we quietly occupied a vacant bench directly opposite the door. There were but 2 or 3 members in our immediate vicinity, whereas the upper portion of the hall was densely crowded. Colonel Olcott and Mohini were doing their utmost to derive some rational and constructive substance from a most fatiguing and unprofitable debate, and I presume that we, situated at the opposite end of the room, were not offering our undivided attention to the proceedings, when suddenly and abruptly the door opposite us opened, and a stout lady clad in black entered swiftly, seating herself at the far end of our bench. I meet our founder. For several minutes she sat listening to the disputation on the platform, soon exhibiting unmistakable signs of impatience. Perceiving no prospect of improvement, she suddenly rose from her seat, imperiously ejaculated the single word Mohini, in a tone of military command, and walked directly out of the door into the corridor. The stately and dignified Mohini came rushing down the length of that long room with the utmost haste, and upon reaching the corridor, immediately cast himself prostrate upon the floor at the feet of the lady in black. Many of those present arose in bewilderment, quite unaware of what was transpiring. A moment later, however, Mr. Sinnett himself ran to the door, stepped outside to exchange a few words, and then, returning to the room, mounted the end of our bench to announce in a ringing voice those fateful words. Let me introduce to the London Lodge as a whole Madame Blavatsky. The ensuing scene defied description. The members, at once ecstatic and filled with a species of reverent awe, thronged about our illustrious founder, some kissing her hand, several kneeling before her, and others weeping hysterically. Within a few minutes, however, She dismissed them with impatience and was escorted to the platform by Colonel Olcott. Having answered a few inquiries, she demanded of him an explanation for the unsatisfactory state of the meeting upon which she had so abruptly descended. The Colonel and Mr. Sinnott offered such explanations as they could muster. She, however, summarily commanded them to bring the meeting to a close, and summoned the officers to convene with her immediately in council. Do you want access to this and all the complete audiobooks on the channel, plus the ebook version? Click the link in the description or scan the QR code in the left corner of the screen to access our library, where you can listen to your favorite esoteric books without ad interruptions, lock your screen, or use other apps while the narration plays, and even download the ebook version to follow along as you listen. Listen on your computer via web browser, or download the app from the Play Store. After subscribing, you will receive an email with your login details, password, and step-by-step instructions on how to access the books through the Hotmart app.